Good morning. How are you? I'm having fine. Everybody had a pleasant weekend. Beautiful weather. Actually took the top off the MG Sunday and went for a little bit of a ride to the backwoods of the country, so it was pleasant. If any of you have been on my YouTube channel, just look at the videos. Again, they're posted. I do them, like I said, I have to do them at night because it takes up so much time. I don't have time between classes to get it done. So up through Thursday's classes have all been posted and uploaded onto the channel, and then this will be posted later on this evening. So that if you get ready to study, they're always there to go back and review and look through. And I'm just posting online in Wolfden just a non-audio portion of it to go from there. And as I said, keep in mind that these are talking points, and so it highlights where in the text you need to go to look to find things out. So we go from there. We'll be starting on Chapter 3 on Thursday and finish it up the following Tuesday, and then start on Chapter 4. And then the first exam will cover through Chapter 4. We decided it will be 50 minutes in length, and do those in class. That'll work out pretty well. Format will be the same as I always do, but I'll have fewer questions, good so I can fit into the time frame. And since we're doing more exams rather than less, it'll make it much easier to focus on your studies as we go forward. So we can take it on from there. Okay. So what have you heard so far about what's going on with IDA now that it's over? Any updates?
Trying to fix everything and bring it all back to how it was.
They're trying to get everything back to where it is. What's the likelihood of that happening? Slim, yeah. There's so much devastation. And one thing that's never talked much about when they have a major disasters is the environmental impact. As we mentioned, you have that in eastern North Carolina where they have all the hog farms, most of which have outside lagoons and whatnot to store the waste. Well, when floods come, where does all that go and the impact that has? The same in that area around LaPlace and outside of New Orleans, so much of the oil refineries are in that area. So that's the impact. And then everybody has in their garages and stuff, pesticides and things of that nature, that if they're not adequately protected, end up being where? Into the soil, into the water system. So that's one of the things that'll be long lasting. And then the interesting thing is the amount of devastation in New England. And it's one of those things where they have several people died, they found in basement apartments, right? But the unfortunate fact is most of those were illegal apartments. People converted them and kept them off the books. And so that's the kind of issue, the founding fathers said that if men were angels, government wouldn't be necessary. And that's an example where I can find an extra buck and don't worry about the consequences. And if you have people that housing in New York is at a premium anyway, they can cause those problems. And so, one thing that disasters always bring out is things that the people are doing that aren't quite by the book and legal to deal with. But your text makes a point in a variety of different ways about what do we know about disasters. First, they're overwhelming. Look at 95 billion is the latest projection I think I saw, and I mentioned that, for total cost for Ida from Louisiana all the way up into New York. And they've got another storm headed into the Gulf now. So who knows what will happen. One thing that was interesting this time is usually when they have hurricanes going through the Gulf, they're talking about their oil platforms. But I hadn't heard any discussion if any of those were damaged or set back in the process. So they could just the nature of them could be overwhelming as we go through. It can be confusing, and even with our best projections that we have through meteorology and things of that nature, they're not 100% accurate. They've always got that cone of uncertainty or whatever that they deal with. And so they can be confusing, and one of the issues that comes across is for government actors, and we mentioned this earlier on, when you have a storm coming, do you close down school or do you leave it open? And no matter what you do, you're going to get fussed at. Because if you close it down and nothing happens, you're wasting money, and if you don't close it down and there's disaster, then why didn't you shut it down? So how do you react? How do you move on? They're often just mishandled. and we'll talk about this later on, is that one of the reasons is that we're always prepared for the last one, not the next one. And then you have confusing lines of authority. Back to the video we saw the first week of class, this importance of coordination and collaboration, and we'll talk a bit more about that as we go through. Mistakes are made. You know, the best intention in the world, you know, things go wrong, and the mistakes may be intentional. And for instance, one of the things is they had somewhere in the New Orleans area, a couple of the nursing homes just evacuated all their patients to a warehouse, and they found five of the patients were dead. So now they've launched a big investigation. Why would they move them to that area without supervision, without adequate supplies? And it stretches capabilities. No matter how well prepared you are, there's always stuff coming on you didn't think about. And in the planning, the scope of especially IDA is just so extensive. The amount of damage is so extensive. It's just, you know, what do we have available to do that, and how much resources do we spend? And that's why you have that coordinated effort between the local governments, the state government, and the federal government, because not everybody can move forward with that. So, you know, those are some of the important things. And so, from a test perspective, you know, we talked about 5 characteristics of what we know about disasters. Tell me about 2 or 3 of them. You know, I would never is a strong word. I seldom, if ever, would ask you to do a complete list, or I'll tell you, we mentioned 5, give me 2 or 3. And again, to highlight as we go through to do that. So move on from there. So that's what we know. So we ended up our discussion on Thursday of last week talking about 9/11 and the impacts that 9/11 had. And as you read through this, especially these first 2 chapters, it's much about this notion of continuous improvement that we talked about, learning from the last one and moving forward. And several of the post 9/11, you can understand in some ways why that happened. But it had disastrous effects, and as we'll see, there are some that suggest that it was the aftermath of 9/11 that led to the botched disaster recovery after Katrina. Right? Because the focus was shifted, the money was shifted from one pot to another, and that got to be important. Law enforcement became the recipient of most of the new monies coming out, because we're concerned, what about terrorism and terrorist attack? And the fact that it was so easily done in attacking the towers and the Pentagon, that obviously was a big concern, right? We went off to fight wars and all those kind of things in response to it. But the challenge is that we come through is that all those resources then get shifted. And, you know, that's kind of human nature. When something happens, you tend to dump a lot of money into it. And as I said last time, with the idea of money and why that's not always the answer, they spent, you know, $14 billion in 16 years fortifying the levee system, and it'll be out of date in another 10 years, just because of changing climate change and things of that nature, rising sea levels. So a lot of it went into law enforcement, and now we see law enforcement that have tanks and you know, MRAPs and helicopters and, you know, all kinds of stuff like that. That were great if your focus is fighting terrorism, you may need those things. But how does that work in disaster recovery? I mean, you need you know, high water vehicles that can get to those areas. You need access to water purification systems. You need access to all those other things, which is somewhat different than if your focus is on just fighting terrorism in dealing with those issues. And again, this last point is key, this change in focus along with FEMA. I mean, Andrew Watt was around, and a lot of managerial issues that came up in that shift after 9/11 that basically led to the failures during Hurricane Katrina. We'll talk more about that in just a little bit too, but there's public perceptions of failures. And again, that's why, you know, one of the key elements that you'll hear over and over and over again is one of the driving factors in emergency management, emergency preparedness, is all about this continuous improvement. Learn from the last time, learn what you did right and maximize those things, and then figure out what you did wrong and what can we put in place to try to, if not eliminate, at least minimize the impact of those same kind of changes taking place. And again, Hurricane Ida, you know, which is interesting, you know, 16 years to the day after Katrina went through, and look at the challenges they had. We mentioned that the 2 big efforts after Katrina was fortifying the levee system and fortifying the electric grid. Well, the levee system held for the most part, and does that mean that they were that well designed, or that the hurricane didn't come in at the same angle as the other? So the good news is it worked. The bad news is how good a test was this? But all 8 of the substations they had put in to help fortify the electric system failed. And so they've now got most of the people in the city of New Orleans back on power, but all those remote areas, it could be 2 to 3 weeks. And if you remember when was it Haiti had the big hurricane a couple, 3 years ago, all the fussing about, you know, how poorly managed they must be because it's going to take weeks. Or who said that about us now? You know, we got the same situation where the scope of the disaster is basically, despite the efforts of the electric co-ops, electric companies, and sending crews, it's going to take time. And if you've seen pictures, the amount of down power lines and the transmission lines and all those things, it'll take time. And that's part of this notion that it's kind of overwhelming in the process. But again, this focus on terrorism and some of the managerial decisions at FEMA took the focus away from emergency preparedness from a natural disaster, focused it predominantly on terrorism and national defense. And so when you go back and look at some of the literature, that's one of the suggestions, is perhaps that was one of the causes why the response to Katrina was so poor. There were other issues obviously in there, but that was kind of the key one as we move forward, this notion that change in focus makes a difference. Your text makes a big point on discussing the difference between tactical and strategic planning. What's the difference? What's tactical planning?
Let's say tactical planning is like putting in a plan right away. Strategic is more long term.
Okay. Makes sense. So tactical will be kind of a more immediate response, okay, as opposed to strategic, which would be more long term. And that's probably the best, easiest way to remember the differences. Is tactical tends to be short term, immediate response to an immediate issue that you need to get ready to go. And strategic is more the long term implications, the long term recovery issues that take place. And in knowing this, they discussed interoperability as an example. Remember what that was all about? So if you're asked to discuss the difference between tactical and strategic, understanding this idea of interoperability is key. Do you remember that from the reading? No? No? Pardon me?
So we like asked what it was.
Yeah, what is interoperability? What's that all about?
Just how like say everything works as one, like kind of like how the government will implement, like somebody will act with you and then everything's going to work together with local state. Right?
No, nice, it's good effort. You get an A for effort on that. But interoperability was a term that they used a lot in regards to the communication system. Everybody on the same frequency, you know, the local government spent massive sums of money upgrading all of their transmissions at 900 megahertz and stuff like that. So they just use this issue of interoperability as an example. So interoperability from a strategic point, from a tactical point of view, was to get everybody reading off the same page at the same time. Okay. The strategic notion of interoperability looks farther, and so we used this example last time as well, that in New York, the fire and the police never talked to themselves much to begin with. So it's back to the cooperation part of it. But from just a broad, easy way to look at it, interoperability on a tactical perspective is the ability of the technology to communicate. So we're all on the same frequency, we have the same bandwidth, all that other kind of stuff. From a strategic point of view, is okay, but how does that work in reality when you have communication differences? And you know, you see that in most every community. There are parts of the community don't talk to other parts of the community, right? So the strategic is more that long-term perspective. How can we make sure that even though we may have the technology, we've done enough preparation by building that trust level to get people to actually work together when the crunch time comes. So bits and pieces of what you had.
So,
Yeah, somewhat, yeah. But again, there's a whole lot more involved, but just from an example perspective, that communication and interoperability of the communication is a great example of the difference between tactical and strategic planning and strategic thinking as we go forward. And so that has a difference when you get into this pre- and post-disaster issues, whether you're looking tactical or strategic. And the reality is that there is a place for both of them, but one should not dominate the other. And so you need to have that broader perspective, because there are a lot of things that are tactical in nature. You look at a problem, you see what the problem is, you address it immediately, and then the strategic is how do we implement that long term. So that's kind of the challenges we go through. Make sense? So again, that's a good example of this notion of strategic versus tactical. There's a role for both, and the challenge becomes an issue when, in fact, we focus one over the other and don't look at both sides of it. And again, the amount of money spent at the local level to upgrade communication systems and stuff. But again, that was an example where what money was available. Grant money was available. Federal government made monies available to have that. So if done well and part of an overall plan, that will be money well spent. If it's supposed to be a substitute with a strategic perspective, we'll have a bit of a challenge doing there. And one of the things I talked about is the shift from event-based to capabilities-based. And just looking at the term, what might the difference between event and capability? What might be the big difference in your planning outlook between event and capabilities?
Capabilities are something that you can do.
Mm-hmm.
The events are concepts that are set.
A little more detail. Good beginning. Okay. What event did they have in downtown Newberry Friday night?
Yeah, no, I have no idea.
They closed down the streets and people would roam around for outdoor shopping and dining
Like
and
a Friday Fest?
something like that.
Okay.
I think they do it first Fridays.
Yeah, so like we do it.
Yeah. So that's an event.
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
It's planned.
So they put something that's planned, they're ready to go, it's a one time. So event planning from this is looking at events and how would I respond to specific events. Okay, make sense? So then what's capability based planning?
Basing everything based on what you're capable of doing.
Yeah, and so how is that different than event specific and capability specific?
Because just because there's an event doesn't mean you're capable of participating.
No. Events are specific things that happen, right?
Yeah.
Right? And so you plan for a specific event. That's event-based. If it's capabilities, that's what we have available. So then the difference is that when an event comes along, you look at what your capabilities are to make it happen. If all you look at is from the event perspective, you don't take that larger view of everything you have available to you. And so what this represents in this time frame is an event, a shift from this idea of preparing for specific events to having what are our capabilities, what are our overall capabilities to respond to an emergency, regardless of the type. And of course, when you're doing capabilities, you look at different events. What capabilities do we have for flood? What capabilities do we have for hurricane? What capabilities do we have for tornado? And all of that fits in fire. But again, it's the specific nature of your planning. And in some ways, it's almost, although not exactly the same, the difference between tactical and strategic, right? You could argue that this event base is more tactical in nature. You're preparing for a specific event for immediate response to that isolated style event, whereas capability is more the strategic outlook. What do we have available long term? And so what we found out was that some of the problems with the National Incident Management System and Incident Command System terms that they used is a lot of those structures were designed on organizations that have a chain of command or a hierarchical structure. What does a chain of command or a hierarchical structure, what might that mean?
Who's in charge?
Who's in charge? And so one of the best examples of a very rigid hierarchical system is the military, is law enforcement, is fire, emergency. You have to have a very specific identified chain of command so everybody knows what their role is and performs those roles, and you have that central line of authority. What they found out over time is that rigid chain of command doesn't work in a lot of other governmental agencies, right? Because they're more flexible, they're more players, not everybody reports to everybody. So the hierarchical is just pretty much a straight linear line in authority and responsibility, non-hierarchical or a variety of other ones, but there's not that same specific strong chain of command. And so again, that was important if you're looking at terrorism, right? Having a rigid chain of command, who does what, when, and centralized organization. But the rest of it doesn't happen. And again, so what they found out is this whole idea of this chain of command, this issue of control, worked great for more structured organizations. It didn't work so well when you tried to force that onto a system that was not nearly as rigid and had a somewhat looser chain of command. And so again, the shift, remember we talked in the first section, what was a lot of the early emergency response was based on who did that. Remember who we talked early on was responsible for emergency response? Military. So what is military? Very rigid structure, chain of command, very hierarchical structure. And as it slowly evolved, and we talked about then the Red Cross played a role, and then in the late 1800s they were kind of given an authority and the Army finally recognized. So different structures that go forward. So a lot of this reflects that shift from the original military, which then became more collaborative and civilian. And after 9/11, it went much more into law enforcement, which is back to the hierarchical structure. And again, that works well from an event base, but not looking at broader issues, broader challenges. And so that was one of the things. So again, not as effective in more diffuse organizational structures. So what you see is this fallback, and the quote that we have, the only thing I learned from the past is we don't pay attention to it. This hierarchical structure works fine in some environments, but not in all environments. And so again, that continuous change, that continuous improvement, moving away from that rigid hierarchical, and that goes back to the video we watched in class, right? This notion of government does not have all the capabilities necessary to respond to every disaster. And so that's why you need to build up the importance of collaborative efforts, cooperative efforts, resources. And then the two that we've specifically mentioned from Hurricane Ida are the Cajun Navy, right? And the former military units that are out there. So that's a challenge that we go for. And that's a big shift, and it's continuing to change. And it's important that we set this groundwork, one of those 4 pillars we talked about. That's important that we understand where we came from so that we can be better at where we're going. I mean, from a technology point of view, what's one of the new technologies that's proving to be incredibly effective in emergency response? Social media? What's another technology? Some of you may have them as toys to take pictures from up in the air. Drones. Drones can get into areas. You see a lot of the coverage that you've seen on the news has been based on drone footage because you can't get crews into some of those areas. So the finding is the technology of drones is being a great resource in firefighting and in emergency response and in finding major damage paths, from getting an overall picture of what's taken place. So technology has changed a lot of that as we move forward. And you can imagine, you know what RFID is?
Just like something to scan.
Yeah, that's radio frequency identification. And some of the things they're talking about now that you may have heard about is eventually your refrigerator will have a scanner and all the products you buy will have an RFID chip embedded in it. So what that allows for the possibility is every time you take something in and out of your refrigerator, it looks at the expiration date, how much is being used, and in the next 20 years, your refrigerator will order food for you using the RFID chips.
I don't like that.
Huh?
Some people will not like that.
Well, you know what's funny about it is when I was a kid growing up, we had Dunning's delicatessen. And what could you could call it Dunnings and place an order to go, and they would deliver it to you. So now to take Amazon, this wonderful new thing, they did that years ago. Wasn't near as efficient, obviously, very, very focused on specific geography. But, that's just part of the challenges out there. And so as the technology improves, all that's going to change the way we respond, the way we plan. It always amazes me, the devices they have for clearing branches along power lines, that long extension boom they have with it. And then the other one that tricks out is the helicopters. Have you seen those? Technology is an amazing thing. But anyway, we're off the subject. But these capabilities will end up more and more. So what does RFID chips have to do? It has to do all kinds of stuff, identify locations. The social media, if you have a watch or your cell phone, most of those have, as long as there's power, ability to find out where you are. And so all of that's going to improve the way we respond and help search and rescue as that technology becomes more embedded in society as a whole. That will then also change what our capabilities are and how we'll respond to that. So lots of things that are out there that are going on that we'll anticipate. And this is a great one of those examples of the quote that you'll hear me use often throughout the semester. It's from Albert Einstein: imagination is more important than knowledge, because knowledge allows you to solve the problems you know about. Imagination allows you to solve the ones we can't think about yet. And so that's also key in emergency management, emergency preparedness, is what's likely to happen and how do you plan for it. But again, keep in mind those 5 things, the fact that they're overwhelming. That gets to make it difficult as you move forward. It shifted from this incident management system to what they call multi-agency coordination system. For the most part, when you have your exam on this first section, the abbreviations and the groups that I would pay particular attention to when you do your reading are the ones that show up on the PowerPoints. There's too many for you to try to think about it and remember. And I'm trying to be nice about it, okay? So the ones that I have on the PowerPoints would be the ones that I would test you on. And so the big ones are FEMA and what we go on, Homeland Security, as you move on from there. So this is, again, part of that transition from lessons learned from Katrina. We found that the terrorism and the hierarchical approach in the event was not as successful as it ought to be. Okay? And so this multi-agency coordination system does several things. One, it facilitates cooperation and collaboration. What's the difference between cooperation and collaboration?
Cooperating is working with, while collaboration is working together.
Yeah, exactly. Good, well put. Collaboration, it means I get all the partners in the decision-making process, right? And work together to do it. Cooperation is just, okay, we've decided, can you help us do these things? So collaboration is a much more involved participatory environment. Get all the players. You just don't make a decision and find people who can help fill in the blanks. You get them at the table. And what's the advantage of getting everybody at the table in putting these things together? Pardon me?
Everyone's on the same page.
Everybody's on the same page, but I always like to say maybe on the same page, but it's different books, right? So yeah, you're absolutely right. You want to get them on the same page. However,
You get more like experts in certain regions. So you'll have someone who does electrical, someone who does water stuff.
Yep. You get more expertise, and you run into that issue of making assumptions. You've all seen the way you can break down the word assume into a different meaning. If you haven't heard it, talk to somebody shaking their head, because I'll get in trouble if I tell you. Okay. But so it helps, get expertise, as Aiden was saying, gets expertise in the process so we know what's going on. But then it also allows you to get true ideas of capacity of what's available. And it's a way to build trust and whatnot that you have to have when you come to emergencies. Because you've noticed in your own environment, if people have a habit of being open and honest communication, and an emergency comes along and they give directions, you accept that as an emergency response because in the general scheme of things, we work together to deal with stuff. So that collaboration is much more involved, much more participatory than cooperation and getting everybody at the table. And again, as you've seen, the news shows have shown insides of emergency preparedness centers, emergency management. You see all the different tables and whatnot that come along that make things tough. And one of the problems you oftentimes run into from a bureaucratic point of view is they want to have a one-size-fits-all. Here's a plan, and you make the plan fit the problem. Whereas, what's a better way to do it? Yeah, work from the problem backwards rather than from the plan forward. Because if you start with a problem, oftentimes you'll identify issues in areas that nobody else thought about. And so sometimes trying to force that one-size-fits-all doesn't work. And sports is a great example of that, right? You don't prepare the same way for each team to play. You know, you understand their strengths and weaknesses as opposed to your strengths and weaknesses, and you adjust your plan accordingly. So you know what you do well, but you still modify those to meet the opponent. Well, that's the same kind of principle that goes here. Right? You start with the objective, the goal, the problem, and you work back from there. And that gets to be a critical difference. The other thing that came up that was really interesting as we move forward, and we'll talk about these more, this universal national planning scenarios, universal task lists, and target capabilities list. Your text goes into great more detail on those things. But what they basically, national planning scenarios, what's a scenario?
Possible outcome.
Yeah, look at possible outcomes. And so you design a scenario and you work through that. What happens if? How would you respond to that? What happens if? How would you respond to that? And you work through those, and you see it in a variety of different ways. You work through those scenarios, and it can highlight issues where you're particularly strong and areas where you're particularly weak. So the national planning scenarios just creates that environment where you can deal with those things. Universal task list and target capabilities, we'll talk about a little bit more with some specifics on those. But what's the difference between a task and a capability?
Task list is like things that have to get done. Target capabilities would be what can be done.
Yeah, what you're able to do. And so your text goes into a great deal of detail about these original lists had more to do with national defense issues and terrorism issues than they had to do with natural disasters and the other kind of disasters faced by local governments. So it was a step in the right direction, and you'll see that's been tweaked as we move forward, as we, again, evolve and move in the direction of getting everybody together on the same page and getting this collaborative effort taking place. Critically important. So the question comes is, up until Hurricane Katrina, how successful? Well, the first one is that you notice that ability of the emergency management, emergency preparedness to change based on what happens in the environment. So that's the good thing. This notion of constant improvement, this idea that we look for ways to do what we do better and whatnot. But the downside, as we've already talked about several times, was it's highlighted the difficulty of using that military hierarchy in just the civilian community. It doesn't work. You don't have that same rigid chain of command. It's one of the famous quotes from American politics and the presidency is Truman was talking about Dwight Eisenhower coming in as president following him. And it said basically, Eisenhower's in for a rough go of it, because in the military, you say jump and people ask how high. In the civilian world, they're going to ask jump and look at you crazy, like, what do you want? What do you think? So it's a different environment. One was a very structured, hierarchical idea, and the other was not quite the same to move forward. Okay. And so the big takeaway is this understanding that success is a relative term. And we'll see with Katrina. But what people look at, and we mentioned this earlier as well, is Hurricane Katrina is viewed in a lot of ways as symptomatic of the changes that took place in emergency response after 9/11. The shift away from natural disasters to terrorism, was focused on more event-based planning, even though there were some changes made to it. And this idea of we knew well in advance the challenges with the levee system, and money wasn't done because it was going to counterterrorism activities. You know, we knew about the New Orleans being below sea level, and this idea of making a toxic soup is what it was called prior to that time, with all those chemicals and pollutants controlled within an area. And that's an idea where the levees are good news and bad news. The levees are they keep things out, but they also keep things in. And so knew about all those things, but again, the funding was such that it was going to counterterrorism activities. And then the response with FEMA and the breakdown with FEMA at the time all represented the shift away from emergency management, emergency preparedness from the broad sense to it being seen primarily as response to terrorism focus. And that led to some managerial decisions within FEMA that removed them from the cycle even more. And again, your text goes into a lot more detail when you talk about that. So the challenges that we have is what's the right answer? And the look you have on your face is what everybody asks, responds when you ask that. You know, there are right answers, but there's no one way to do everything, and that ability to locally be able to respond. You see that at the local level with simple things as intergovernmental agreements for services. You know, we talked about fire service and the issue that early days, we use Charleston as an example of having those fire logos on the side that showed you were paying your insurance rates for fire service. And we mentioned the opportunities where political boundaries get in the way, where a fire is in a different district and you can't cross district lines. So a lot of those concerns can be addressed through intergovernmental agreements, right? Inter-service agreements, in some ways they're called. But that takes collaboration, cooperation, that willingness to work together. And unfortunately, South Carolina is no different. That's when a lot of the infighting comes across. It makes perfect sense, and you try to argue with folks. If I call an ambulance, do I care whether it's from Prosperity or Newberry? I want an ambulance to show up. But too often when you try to look at these cooperative efforts, it gets into being a turf war. Who's going to get credit? Who's going to be in charge? And again, that's between the tactical and the strategic. You know, I can have everything technologically available to do it, but if the groups don't like each other, work together in the first place, what difference does it make? And so that's one, again, so many of the takeaways we have from the section is this idea that there is no such thing as one size fits all. You have to understand your local capabilities and challenges, and you'll face those when you put together your strategic emergency plan as we go forward. This becomes a great way to look at things. So what do we know about the emergency response after Hurricane Katrina? You've all seen pictures, you've heard stories. What are some of the things we think about when we think about Hurricane Katrina and the aftermath? Almost like there was no real plan. What are other memories that you have having read or seen on the media?
Nice big pool.
Yeah, it turned into a nice big pool with the levees holding, especially the lower 9th Ward in those areas. Yeah, it's just, yeah, yeah, big pool. What else do you remember?
No police at all.
Pardon me?
There was like no police for the longest time, for a little bit, right after.
And why was that?
Because, I mean, everybody seen it, there was nowhere to drive. You only have so many boats.
Yeah. So law enforcement was an issue. So you had episodes of police officers on bridges shooting at people, which was just stupid, right? You had the issue of a lot of the police records were destroyed in the flooding, and so people were released from jail. So how do you keep track of those things? And we all know how well-behaved people are during emergencies. How they all work together and share resources, right?
Borrow resources without telling the owner.
Yes, they borrow resources without tearing. Yeah, I'll replace them at some point, but yeah. And so how do you handle that control? How do you handle a law enforcement effort when a lot of the population is well behaved and works together, but there are always going to be those people who want to take advantage of situations? How do you deal with those things? Or a couple other things you remember from Hurricane Katrina. What's one of the big sporting venues in New Orleans? Superdome. So what stories you remember hearing about the Superdome? The roof, part of the roof was blown off. It was also one of those areas that was an evacuation center. It wasn't stocked to be an evacuation center. So you had all the horror stories of backed up toilets and people laying dead in the hallways and just a disaster. You know, that's a big old building, you know. But it wasn't very successful. What do you remember hearing about the convention center? Exactly the same challenges you had at the Superdome, right? A lot of people ill-prepared, no overall coordination for what took place. The fact that so many people did not have the ability to leave, evacuate, so they ended up going where they could. The places weren't necessarily well prepared. And we know that in the aftermath, a lot of the people from New Orleans were sent to other cities to help. We had City of Columbia open its doors and had a lot of people came in from Louisiana, from New Orleans area to stay during the recovery period. And again, as I mentioned before, I was down there a year afterwards, and it was still like a war zone. And so some of the post-recovery issues that we know about, and you'll see that same thing coming up with Ida, is most cities have planning and zoning ordinances that tell you how much of your building can be rebuilt in the event that it's damaged. And given the age of the building and the construction techniques at the time, there's an arbitrary, it's not universal, but it's kind of, if it's 50% or less, you can go ahead and fix it up. If it's more than 50%, you got to tear it down and rebuild it to current standards. Well, which do you think is the more expensive, fixing up what you've got or tearing it down and rebuilding? Tearing it down and rebuilding, absolutely. So when you have a low-income area, to do that becomes somewhat devastating, right? So they modified a lot of their planning in that area to allow people to rebuild, even though it had more than that amount of damage, from its pure economic perspective. Then you had issues that I mentioned in here, where how do you get emergency funds to people when they've lost everything they've got? So one of the ways you want proof of identity that this is who you are and you live here. Well, if you had to leave your house and everything is destroyed, you don't have your wallet, how do you prove who you are? Yeah, well, DNA, that's not going to work either. And DNA is not all that terribly available. So one of the things that they did in order to get the monies out sooner is they just had people basically sign an affidavit that, yes, this is where I live, this is my address, and they gave them the money. Again, get the money into the hands of help and recovery. The problem with that is the media reports found that small percentage of folks that use the money to take cruises and get, voluntary medical treatment done, like, plastic surgery. Were there people that did that? Absolutely. But it was such a small minority. Most of the people was just needed. Because, you don't think about this. How many of you have debit cards? If you need money, you go to the bank or someplace to get it, right? Or if you lose power or communication, how are you going to get money out of the machines? Yeah, you save it. You save it under your mattress, right? And then you get flooded, and your mattress floats away.
You keep like 100 in your wallet. You keep 100 in your wallet. You keep your wallet on you at all times.
You sleep with your wallet?
Yeah.
Whoa. We need to talk. You have some serious, no. Right? But you would think we do that, but the reality is that's not the way people work. I mentioned before, we know we have power outages, yet how many people have solar chargers for their phones? Right? So, and those kind of things we think about. I mean, that happens periodically when we have big sunspots. it knocks down the communication system and you can't use your debit card at the gas station. Talking about gas, what's one of the things they've done in Louisiana to help ease the gas shortage? They've allowed the refineries to start selling winter gasoline rather than summer gasoline. There are different configurations in what goes into the gasoline additives, whether it's a winter or summer blend. And the summer blend is a little bit more expensive and more time consuming. So in order to get more gasoline, because if you've seen the news, the long lines of people waiting for hours to get gas for their generators, right? So they're trying to make some of those adjustments. The problem is every time you change the rules to help people out, there are always going to be those that take advantage of it. And this will be the same way in the process. Okay? So the general consensus is we have a lot of issues that came up after Hurricane Katrina. And a lot was a lack of coordination, because what you found early on is the federal government got blamed, but they said, well, it's not our fault. The state didn't let us know. And the state said, wait a minute, the city didn't let us know that they needed an emergency. Yeah. Coordination, who's responsible for what, getting those things done. So you'll see that in preparation of Ida coming through, the natural disaster was already declared before it actually hit land. So you had the resources available early on. Okay. How are we doing after Ida? How well do you think we're doing? From what you've seen and read.
A little better, because the last one there was a contract was called in to be released. So.
Yep. So a little bit better. I think this also highlights the different emergency response, whether in a major metropolitan area or a more rural, remote site. And so the example is LaPlace. They didn't have near the resources that New Orleans had. They didn't have levee protections. And then the scope of Ida, even although Katrina did up doing a good bit of damage up in Charlotte area and moved some other places, it wasn't the same effect as what Ida has had across the board. So I think some of the takeaways when you look at it is there's been a much more collaborative effort. There's been a much more early response and preparation to put everything in motion to make it happen. And now they're just dealing with this notion of it being overwhelming. You know, how do you get rescue vehicles in when they can't get in? There were certain spaces in New York where from this era you saw these big fires raging, but the fire departments had no way to get there because all the roads were flooded. She just had to let things burn out, which then added to the pollution, added to all those things that goes on. So this notion that, you know, every disaster is unique, and you can have general lessons learned and try to build as much of that you can into your plan, but there are always things that exceed your ability to plan or exceed your ability to consider the possibility. And that makes sense. And those people in those rural areas are going to spend weeks before they get their power back. And how does lack of gasoline impact power and the ability to have electricity? Generators run on gasoline. There are some in upscale areas that run on natural gas. But if you had a big flood, your LP tank probably floats away as well. You have access to that. But they run on gas or diesel. And if there's no gas, all your preparation didn't help you out because there's no gas to be able to run those things. So I think some of the lessons we learned is you can be as prepared as you want to be, but there's still things going to happen, back to this notion that it's overwhelming, that there are mistakes are going to get made. You know, but Team Rubicon, which I mentioned earlier, was a military unit, and then Cajun Navy are just two great examples of cooperation among volunteers. And of course, Red Cross has been down there. You also see the cooperative effort from the private sector with all of the electric service vehicles that are down from all over the region helping to restore power. And that's a cooperative agreement between most of the power companies across the country. They'll jump in and help each other out in the process. Lesson learned. And again, your text goes into great detail on these things, but from our purposes, what did we learn about this from a community level response?
Communities by themselves two things, either work together, be beneficial, or move wrong.
Yeah. So you need this community level response because they're going to be the first responders. The fire, the police, the emergency medical technicians. So you need to have that planned out and ready to go because you need to have your resources available. And that goes into simple things that where do you put your resources? How do you distribute your emergency vehicles so that they all don't get destroyed at one time? What kind of responses do you have or cooperative agreements you have with surrounding communities to have mutual aid and support in the process? All that gets to be important. State level response. What's one of the things that the state oftentimes does to respond to a national emergency or a statewide emergency? Evacuation. And what does South Carolina do to aid evacuation?
Two lanes. They
Yeah,
allow you
the lane reversals that they have to help aid in evacuation. What's also something very common for states to do in response to emergencies? Declare a state of emergency. But what group do they have readily available that can be recalled at any point in time to help aid the state in response to emergencies? National Guard, right? You see that quite often. Some of the units from the South Carolina National Guard went down to Haiti in the Caribbean during the hurricane response. And you see that some areas they've already mobilized. You've seen that mobilization in COVID-19 response. In some states, they've mobilized medical personnel from the National Guard or activated them from the military to come and help in that process. But from the state level, it's that mobilization of the Guard to help the homeland. The federal level responses. What's the big thing that they offer? Starts with M. Money, right? They have emergency assistance, emergency loans to help fund recovery efforts. But also from the federal government, you have the Coast Guard, which gets involved in a lot of recovery efforts, right? And then the national government can then also mobilize a lot of other resources that are not available at the state or the local level. So we each have a role to play, but it's kind of this notion of cascading. The local folks have to have that first initial reaction of pre-positioning resources that are needed to help respond to disaster. State level comes in predominantly in funneling some funds, which they get from the federal government, but can mobilize state level resources, can move the highway patrol or the state police around to help out in other areas, can mobilize the National Guard as we move forward. It gets to be important. The federal level response comes from a lot of money, but also with the Coast Guard and other military units that they can call in to help things out. And the volunteer efforts, the importance of volunteers is back to this idea that no one organization has all the capabilities that are needed to respond to a disaster. So relying on volunteer organizations to help jump in where they can. And again, you see that in a lot of church-based groups will go on mission trips to help recover areas, rebuild houses, things of that nature. And then again, the immediate response that's available. And the importance of coordination, the importance of everybody talking to each other and make sure we're all moving in the same direction with the efforts. So when we look at what's evolved from 9/11, which moved it toward a terrorism aspect, a lot of money went to terrorism. We shouldn't have about the local governments all that much because that wasn't a major concern for most of them. But what the focus then shifted was away from natural disaster and emergency preparedness in a large sense, more to responding terrorism. That then focused the money and resources to go toward those activities involved in law enforcement and prevention. And again, that shifted the focus away from the broader view of natural disasters. And so based on that environment, FEMA made certain managerial decisions that lessened its role. And then when Katrina came through, it was evidence that we had lost focus. We'll talk a bit more about that as well. And so some of the lessons learned from that period are these 5 issues. That importance of everybody working together in coordinated effort as we move forward. Yeah. And this is always a problem, expectations versus reality. And your text goes at great length about this notion when looking at Hurricane Katrina. And it comes back to this other thing we've talked about in the evolution, is what does the public expect from government in the emergency response?
Immediate perfect response, which
Or-
never happens.
Huh?
I said people expect immediately perfect response,
Yeah.
which never happens.
Yeah, immediate response. You know, the government's going to take care of everything. And we've already talked about early on about, you know, most things that you read about emergency management, emergency preparedness, talk about 72 hours in advance. And while we're on that topic, I haven't heard from anybody. We need to set a date the second half of October to do our radio show, which, you know, highlights Newberry, and they want us to come in and talk about emergency preparedness. Do we have any cheerful volunteers who want to show up that day for extra credit on the final grade? Oh, come on. You can't hide behind the mask. I know you're urging to do it. Yeah. No? Huh? Okay. Aiden?
Possibly. It depends on which day it is.
It'll be a Monday or a Friday, and we can pick the date in the second half of October.
Do we know the time?
9 o'clock in the morning. And since this is a class-sponsored event, you'll get an excuse from class that day. To make sure.
Yeah, I can probably.
Okay? Okay. And I know you want to do it, so I've got you on the list.
Yeah, I'll do it.
Okay, you're on the radio show.
Oh, of course, just like last year, okay.
Yeah, see, you have experience with this. Ms. Johnson, you want to jump in on this? I'd like to get about 4 folks to volunteer. Huh? Good on you. Okay, we got our 4 volunteers. Good. And you all want to have about 3 or 4 minutes each. And what we'll do when we get the date picked, we'll talk about that next Thursday. So think about second half of October, a Monday or a Friday. And then what we'll do, you only have about 3 or 4 minutes when it comes down to it, right on the air. And so we'll divide it up into different topics, and you each have put together 3 or 4 minutes in topics, and go from there. And then we'll talk Thursday. Look through your schedules. Second half of October will be after the break. That'll be after our exams. All that stuff will be behind you, and you'll have time. So we'll talk about that Thursday. Good job. See this exciting stuff?
I get that first.
Yeah. Plus 5 points on your extra credit for your class doesn't hurt either on doing your final grade, right?
It does not.
Helps out. Yeah, so this idea is that we've come to expect a lot more from government and a lot less from ourselves. Okay. Which then raises the question, to what degree do we actually prepare ourselves for disasters? And again, most of us wait until something's happening, we run to the grocery store and then everything's gone. You know, I have a well that I can run off of my generator. I have city water, as long as that's available to do that. I have a septic system, so I'm not worried about, you know, the citywide or whatever waste management issues. I have a pond where I can draw water and boil if I need to, and I rotate my stock of drinking water. Every month I'll buy a case, 24 bottles, and I keep that stockpiled, and I rotate them out as the expiration dates come closer. I have my cans of Beanie Weenie.
Oh, yeah.
Got to have Beanie Weenies. You got to have Vienna sausages. All that important stuff. Spam. I mean, it lasts for generations. You're particularly brave. You can go online and order MREs to keep. And huh?
MREs aren't terrible.
Wait. MREs are a whole lot better than the little cans of stuff that we had.
I don't get skills.
Huh?
You eat candy in MREs.
Yeah, if you were lucky, you would get the MRE packet that had peanut butter and jelly and crackers, and those were worth their weight in gold to swallow. If you got the pork or the ham, you had to spend the first part scoping the fat that congealed on top off of it. Yeah, it's gotten much better. So the public doesn't do a really good job. And rumors become distraction. And your text talks specifically about, rumors of murders and dead people laying around. There was headline news, and there are actually very, very, very few cases of that. So again, it's this idea that the media's job, and you always have to keep in mind, is to sell papers. And that makes a great highlight. But the fact of the matter is, yeah, did it happen? Yeah. Is this an excuse for it happening? No. But it got more attention than it deserved because it helped fit a story about unpreparedness. So that becomes a challenge as we move forward on that. Ultimate lesson from Katrina is that we must prepare for the next disaster, not the last one. That strategies and plans and hierarchical organizations don't work across the board, so that chain of command issue. And planning must include all actors, back to the collaboration we talked about. So those are the three big takeaways that we learned from that. One is that we got to prepare for the next rather than the last. And hierarchy and chain of command doesn't work across the board, and collaboration. See a test question already, can't you? Right. And then your text has a lot more discussion detail on this change. It's gone away from the incident management and things to this national preparedness system. And the components in your text talks a bit more about this, is this planning to deliver capabilities. It's not enough to know what you've got. You have a plan in place to make sure it happens. You know, in some ways, it's the planning equivalent of potential. Doesn't matter how much potential they have, if you don't work, make it happen, it's not going to happen. So not only planning, but validating the capabilities. Do you really have what you say you have? Do you have them in the quantities and the quality that you think you need to have? And again, this is spelled out in your text as well. This need for a process of ongoing review and updating. And as I said before, the planning document should be the most dog-eared, ratty-looking books you have on your organizational bookcase, because you always need to be looking at them, reviewing them, take advantages. And where that becomes critical that we don't think about is look at the change in population along the coast since Katrina went through, right? Or in South Carolina since Hugo went through. If you don't update that information, that data, you're not going to be in a position to respond. You have to have the ability to identify and assess risk. And that's a whole field, risk assessment, risk analysis, risk prevention. That's a growing field out there to be able to go in and estimate risk and what's possible to happen. And to do that, you have to have a very vivid imagination over what's possible. And so we have organizations such as a lot of the engineering firms have reached cooperative agreements in some parts of the states where their engineers will go into school systems and look at their preparedness from an emergency response. Are their facilities adequate? Are their electrical issues strong enough to do that? So there are ways to make this happen. Estimating capabilities. And again, what do you have available, and then how accurate is our assessment of what we say we have available? And this building and sustaining capabilities. The thing that we lost most after 9/11 was we shifted focus away. So you got to have a plan to be able to deliver what you've got. You've got to be able to verify the capabilities are what you say they are. You've got to constantly be reviewing and updating your plan to look at changes in the environment, changes in technology. Right? We always have to be identifying and assessing risk. What are the risks for a hurricane coming through here? Well, distance away from the coast makes it less devastating. But again, look at the way Ida happened. How many places in New England planned for hurricanes? They planned for nor'easters. To move on from there, estimating the requirements of what you need to have to get those resources available, and then building and sustaining those capabilities. Training, doing mock exercises. To be critically important as we go forward. Okay. The key changes that have come out of all of this that are kind of driving, and again, your text talks about this at great length. It set the priorities that we should keep in mind when we look at a response: to save lives, to protect property and the environment, to help stabilize the environment, to get people moving forward, to be able to meet basic human needs: food, water, shelter, medical care. And you see that's one of the big challenges they're having now, especially in New Orleans or Louisiana, is getting food and water to places that are still flooded, getting access to the services. It also established guiding principles that we should look for. This idea of partnerships. Anybody who can't remember partnerships, we talked about it in so many ways so far. Is a new model of emergency management is identifying partners. This idea of a tiered response, federal, state, local, and be able to, in some ways it's almost like the cascading, but from a positive point of view. Certain levels, certain response, certain levels, certain response, certain levels, certain response. This idea of being flexible. And again, that ties into the shift away from event planning, right, to capabilities planning. And be flexible. Unified command, and again, this isn't unified command in the same structure that we talked in a hierarchical chain of command. It's this idea of unified command so that everybody's working for the same purpose. And a good example of that is how when the Red Cross or volunteer organizations do, they'll oftentimes have a seat at the table in the emergency response, emergency command center. So we coordinate efforts as we go through and be ready to act. We even in our church have two telephone trees, one for meals after funerals and the other's for mowing lawns in preparation for funerals. So we've got somebody who's in charge and it rotates back and forth. What plans you have in place? How do you plan for contingencies? And making sure you're ready to act, which means training and practice. It's back to one of my issues with people with weapons. That's all great, but if you don't do ongoing familiarization and live fire, you're not really prepared to use the weapon when the time comes.